What's your minimum specification? Everybody today is in a fuss about chipsets and socket support and what the thing is going on with AMD. Now, for years, we've had to deal with CPUs that require specific sockets and specific chipsets. When you buy a CPU, you need a motherboard with the right socket and a compatible chipset or south bridge. Now, this chipset governs a lot to do with the operation. Most people associate it with the I/O, with the additional SATA support or additional NVMe or PCIe support. But in reality, it governs a lot more than that. It governs the BIOS boot up sequence and to a certain extent, memory compatibility. Now, AMD, since 2016, has been running with the AM4 socket for its most recent Ryzen processors. And we've been through AM4 during 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Now, typically, you pair the AM4 socket with a particular chipset. And we've had chipsets like the A320, B350, X370, B450, X470, X570, and the upcoming B550 that was just announced. Now, the X series has always been the high end of the market. B series has sort of been that sort of mid to low end market, and the A series for the embedded and integrated and very cheap end of the market. Now, recently there's been a kerfuffle with compatibility. Which AM4 CPUs will work in which motherboards? And some people have been saying that AMD has been disingenuous with marketing. And recently I reviewed the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X over at Anantech. But here on TechTechPotato, I'm going to tell you why AMD's done this before, kinda. And this is the reason why Intel updates its chipsets every 2 years. So I'm going to go straight to the slide that's caused all of the kerfuffle, and it's this one. So this is AMD's support grid. This is the chipsets that are meant to work with the processors listed. Now, this is all listed as official support. Now, I'm going to have official support here as a defined term. And official support is what AMD and the motherboard vendors are meant to guarantee to validate to the point where you have a warranty claim if you request. So here, if you buy a B350 motherboard, AMD is guaranteeing Ryzen 1000, Ryzen 2000 with Radeon, Ryzen 2000, Ryzen 3000 with Radeon support. Whereas if you get the X470, you then get the standard Ryzen 3000 Zen 2 desktop processors. B450 is meant to be the same, and then X570 you lose Ryzen 1000 and Ryzen 2000 with graphics, which is Ryzen 1000 by another name with their APUs. And what you get here is this staircase formation as newer chipsets support the latest CPUs and peel away support for the oldest CPUs. And this primarily is a function of BIOS size, would you believe it? Every motherboard here is shipped with a ROM chip, with a BIOS chip, of a limited size, and the standard in the industry is 128 megabit or 16 megabyte, just because it's stupidly expensive. Stupidly cheap. It's when you get higher capacities it becomes stupidly expensive. And in that BIOS, in that 16 megabytes, you have to be able to put everything that AMD supplies with the AGISA. And don't forget, a lot of these processors actually have different AGISA support internally. They have to have all the features required for the motherboard, so that might be fan control, that might be overclocking support, that might be support for specific add-in cards, PCI cards, SATA expansion cards, RAID cards, FPGAs, large GPUs. And then they also have all the graphics, and in some cases in motherboards in the past we've had sounds. If you may remember, ASRock in some of their BIOSes have had a sparkly, twinkly background. Now you can either do that as an animated GIF, or you could be actually funky and actually design the graphics using assembly. But the point is, it all takes up space, and you have a limited space. Now, in that space, you have to put in the microcode to support families of processors. So if we go to something simple here, this is the B550 Tomahawk, a very famous MSI board for various reasons. And here we have listed support for, the latest Zen3 Matisse processors. Then we have, slightly older Picasso processors. Along with consumer models, we've got support for the Pro models. And then we go through, 2000 series, 2000 series Pro, some Athlons, some Summit Ridge processors, no A series Bristol Ridge processors on this motherboard, despite it being called B450, because those original Bristol Ridge series processors aren't even in this table. So we get to a point where the motherboard vendors have to put in the code for all these processors. Typically, they put them in as a family, and you should be able to get by with a family. Some of them are, family adjacent, which makes them a bit more difficult. And we get to a point where, as we go from having, 10 processors with the 1000 series, moving through 20 processors and 30, up to 40, and I think we're on about 70 processors now. And then we actually have a database here that I'll just pull up, AMD Consumer. So we have Carrizo support. This actually supported Carrizo. That's 6 processors. We've got Bristol Ridge and Bristol Ridge Pro. That's 20. We've got the 2000 series Pro, the APU, and the AM4. That's 21, and then we've got the 3000 series. Eventually, it all adds up to the point where we've now got, if one motherboard supported all Ryzen 3000 processors, we will have 86 processors supported. If, theoretical motherboard to support 86 AM4 processors. That's Bristol Ridge, Summit Ridge, Raven Ridge, Pinnacle Ridge, Picasso, Matisse, and some of the Carrizo parts as well. So you may think, well, that's a lot of processors, that's a lot of families. If you have a bigger BIOS chip, if the motherboard vendor puts in the 32 megabyte or 256 megabit chip, then you'll be able to support more. So what we've been talking about here is official support. You also have what's called unofficial support. So a motherboard vendor may support more than what you see on the screen here. And that's what's called unofficial support, which means that it's not qualified support from the side of AMD. The motherboard vendor may qualify support, and it's up to them to give you the warranty based on that support. Now, one of the issues here, with say you buy a B350 motherboard, and the reason why it doesn't support the latest processors is because if that BIOS was upgraded, you might lose support for some of the older processors. So if somebody's running an old 1000 series processor, you end up having a BIOS which is basically say, if you have this CPU, don't upgrade the BIOS. But then you also have some of these motherboard vendors, like MSI, have auto updates, live update software, which will automatically update the BIOS if it detects a new one on the servers. So then you get into this mix of, well, what's supported and what isn't, which is almost kind of what AMD's problem is here. So this graph, as it stands, could be the be-all and end-all of the conversation. A lot of people are up in arms because B450 is relatively modern, and X470 is relatively modern, but it won't support future Zen3 processors. And if people were buying those boards with the 2000 series chips or the 3000 series chips ready to go to the 4000 series chips, and they wanted an upgrade path, you're now relying on the unofficial support from the motherboard vendors. There will probably be a few, though experiences will be hit and miss. And motherboard vendors could pull support any time because if it's unofficial support, they don't have to support it. And then recently we've had, like I said, the release of the Ryzen 3 3100 and the 3300X budget chips, $100, $120. you're going to be pairing it with a budget board like the B450 or the B550. Now the B550 isn't out yet. We've still got to wait a while for those. Exact dates unsure. So if you went out and bought that CPU now, you have to buy it with the B450, and there's no upgrade path there. And those are the sorts of chips that users may buy to upgrade in the future. Like I say, AMD could have had a solution for this, and it's kind of a solution that they've had in the past, and that's by calling the 500 series chipsets AM4 Plus, denoting that they support 3000 processors and above, or at least 3000 desktop processors. One could argue that the B550 should be able to support the 3000 APUs, but again, that's a function of BIOS size and ROM size and what's that. So if they called it AM4 Plus, it would still technically be the same socket, and they would still have AM4 socket support. It would just be chipset support dependent on the processor line. Now, like I say, they've done this before. Who remembers AM2? AM2 released in 2006 as a socket replacement for socket 949. Now, socket 949 looks kind of similar. That's because AM2 actually has 940 pins. It's pretty much the same socket, just with an extra pin. I think it's actually this bottom one in the corner here. And AM2 was launched, single core Orleans and Semprons and Athlon 64FX, and eventually we got socket AM2 Plus. Now, all the socket AM2 processors could technically work in AM2 Plus if you had BIOS support and additional technical specifications. So here we've got Hypertransport 3. So if the motherboard was capable of supporting Hypertransport 2, and then also being able to deal with the power planes. And so AM2 Plus is still 940 pins here. Next we had AM3. AM3 is still 941 pins. The CPUs only had 938. And it says it breaks compatibility with AM2, AM3, but essentially these are the same chips in the same arrangement. But AM3 added in DDR3. So you can only use processors with DDR3 memory controllers. So this is kind of almost the same thing. And then we had AM3 Plus, which again was 940 odd pins in the socket, and you could support the standard AM3 processors. And the processors that came out specifically for AM3 Plus were the Bulldozer, high power Bulldozer ones. But even then, with AM3 Plus, you remember the FX 9590 and that 220 watt TDP? Some motherboards wouldn't accept that. They were specifically written out of the BIOS because the motherboard couldn't accept it for a variety of reasons. It's most usually power, but the point here is that AMD had roughly the same socket for 5 generations, but they split it up every couple of generations by having a plus, then they increase the number by 1. So in this instance, with AMD running all the way to AM4, which is again it's a similar sort of socket, but it's 1300 pins this time. If they had gone with AM4 Plus to denote the X550 and the X570, this would have given them a free pass. They could say, well, hey, it's still kind of the same socket, but it's a plus. It's for additional support. And then when the Zen3 processors, which we assume are going to be called Ryzen 4000, come out, yeah, those are AM4 Plus processors only, and everybody would have been happy. I assume everybody would have been happy. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then we'd have maybe a year of that, and then we assume AMD is going to go to DDR5 at some point, and then we can go all the way up to AM5. And if you believe some leaks, then maybe AM5 already exists in some form. But this is where we stand with AMD's chipset arrangement. And yeah, if you bought a B450 with a Zen 2 processor, expecting to upgrade to a Zen 3 later, yeah, kind of sucks. I'm sorry about that. It's B550 motherboards are going to be cheap enough upgrades. I mean, we expect the B series to be anywhere from $80 up, really. So you could go super budget there. At this point, is anybody recommending a B450 motherboard purchase? I mean, X570 can go as low as $150. I believe there's like MSI Pro A or A Pro. There may be a couple of versions like that available for the market, and they'll support Zen 3. Whether you want the highest core count Zen 3 on those low-end boards is a different matter. You know, it's one might argue if AMD wanted to retroactively kind of help themselves, then maybe, you know, going back and rebadging the X570 and the B550 as AM4 Plus wouldn't be such a bad idea. Now, don't forget, B550 has actually been delayed. We expected it to come out months ago. People were talking about it back in January at CES, and we're expecting a quick launch then with the Zen 2 processors, and it's just taken its time, just for this kind of reason. Now, I've heard commentary that AMD knew this was going to be an issue. You know, for the amount of people that they have on the payroll, the analysts, I'm surprised nobody suggested, or maybe they did and AMD just didn't do it, suggested AM4 Plus. That really would have, you know, just made it a lot easier to understand, a lot easier for everybody to understand. Because from my perspective, I'm going to be going back and testing all these CPUs as we upgrade our test beds and our benchmarks. Now I'm going to have to say, well, what motherboard do I need for what processors? It's all AM4 socket, so this is going to get confusing for me as well. So I'm going to have to use an X370 for Bristol Ridge, because most of those support Bristol Ridge. Then I'm going to have to use an X470 for anything up to Zen 2, and then Zen 3 I can use, you know, B550 and above. Yeah. Now, one sideline completes to all of this, which I think is not necessarily being addressed in the media, is why are these ROM chips only 128 megabit, or why are some of them 256 megabit? In the server space, we see 256 megabit, and even some 512 megabit ones. Why are they so expensive? You know, you can buy a 1 gigabyte micro SD memory card for pennies in bulk. So, you know, I hear people saying, well, you know, the larger BIOS chips, you know, twice as much, 3 times as much, which means that they're going from, you know, either 10 cents to 30 cents or 50 cents to $1.50 or whatever the metric's going to be, and that's going to pass the cost on to the end user. Now, yes, I agree, perfectly valid point. There are lots of markets, for example, the Southeast Asia, where people buy the cheap chips with the cheap motherboards, and every dollar counts, every cent counts, because the margins there are going to be low. These are people who are going to buy the $60 motherboards with the you know, the cheapest CPUs. They maybe perhaps not going to be buying the cheapest Zen 2 CPUs right now, but that's the source systems they're going to. And I've had motherboard vendors tell me that they'll take a product, say, to India, to one of their big markets, and they will have a vendor that turns around and says, well, I don't want the VGA port, or I don't want the DVI-D port on the back panel, because that build a version without it, because I know that costs 3 cents to add on there and extra support, and I don't want that in my systems, in the 10,000 systems I'm doing. So a company like Gigabyte will actually go and make a variant of their motherboard without that port for that customer, and then they might make 50,000 boards and then sell the other 40,000 on the open market as an actual product. This is why you sometimes see Gigabyte or MSI or Asus with 100 different models, because certain customers wanted very specific models. Now, in those boards, yeah, you want the cheapest BIOS. You're not going to you're not going to have cheap BIOS graphics. And the thing is here, with what AMD's done with these chipsets, is you've got the A320, or you've got the B450. These are cost-down designs. the X4, the X370, the X470, the X570, they're cost up designs, so there's more incentive for them to spend an extra 10 cents, an extra 30 cents to get the larger BIOS chip. But again, we come back to, why are the BIOS chips so small when Flash, NAND Flash, is comparatively so cheap? And maybe it's time we had a big rethink on the BIOS system, the basic input-output of the startup of the system. We've recently had an innovation in the power supply space. We now have the ATX 12VO standard, which removes the 5 volt and the 3.3 volt off of the power supply and requires the motherboard to transform them. But it means that the cables for the power supplies are thinner, are easier to manage, and we're only dealing with a single rail system. So ultimately, they're also more efficient if you don't need those 5 volt and 3.3 volt rails. So we need a BIOS, we need a change in the way the BIOS is dealt with on these motherboards. It's been the same for 20, 30 years. And maybe this would get around all of this problem. Imagine having 1 gigabyte of BIOS space. You would have fancy graphics, you would have custom installs of Linux inside there. You'd get somebody will try and run Skyrim inside the BIOS. You know it's going to happen. The thing is that innovation going to come from the motherboard vendors? Is it going to come from AMD or Intel or somebody else? The person who does it is going to be expensive for the partners for that. Yeah, there's no incentive to change it. And unfortunately, even with all these CPUs on the chipsets, there isn't going to be incentive. I do want to highlight one other point as well, just to bring up my database here. Maybe I'll share this with people one day. But socket 1150 for Intel, that was Z87 and Z97. Z87 supported 83 different desktop processors. Now, they were all the same family, I grant you. These are all dual core and quad cores, but 83 different processors. If you add in Broadwell, that was technically another 6, plus some of those boards also supported the Xeon E3s. So we're now getting into a point where you're supporting almost 100 CPUs within a BIOS, within a 16 meg BIOS. It was about that time that UEFI was coming along, so we got more graphical interfaces. But yeah, okay, so socket 1156. This was Z68 and Z77, Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge. I've got here that there are 105 processors, desktop processors in that family. AMD's dealing with 84 and it can't. Intel dealt with 105 and could, but without the graphical parts of the BIOS. It's maybe per CPU, AMD requires a lot more. Or it comes back to what I said about different Agisas for all the different families are actually just rolled into one big, tarball. So they're going to be competing for space there. Now, these model vendors have to decide, do they want the graphical features in the BIOS? Do they want these overclocking features, or do they want CPU support? And it's being done on a board-by-board basis. If there are any motherboard vendors watching this, if you came out with a motherboard with a 64 megabyte BIOS chip, now yes, it's going to add $5 to the cost of the motherboard, whatever. That supported every AM4 CPU currently on the market. I will use that board for my regression testing, just because I know it will support everything. Yeah, it may be a bit more expensive. Okay, maybe it's just me that wants it. Okay, me and other reviewers, right? So that's my rant about AMD's current situation. I really think they should have gone with the AM4 naming. That would have made it somewhat easier. I mean, for B450 owners who wanted to upgrade, it's still not great. Hopefully there'll be a motherboard vendor who does unofficially support Zen3 for you. Though if you've already got B450 boards, then I guess that's neither here nor there. Sorry about that. If you like the content, if you like my ramble, don't forget to like and subscribe, updoot and do the bell thing, the bell thing. I've been Ian Cuttress and you've been watching TechTechPotato. Thank you.